My name is Martin Bunton, Interim Director at the Center for Global Studies, filling in for Oliver Schmidtka. My real pleasure to be able to host these global talks for this year. We start with acknowledging and respecting the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory we are increasingly beginning to gather in person, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with these lands and these waters continue to this day. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker today. One is that we ask you to keep your video and your audio off during the presentation, but then I think we sort of would encourage you to turn in your video on during the Q&A. And if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please either wave to us or note it in the chat, or put your hand up according to the Zoom function, and we will turn to you in turn. There is the chat function, which can be really usefully used, I think, for sharing ideas and questions and observations and making links. The presentation is being recorded, as you've already been informed. So, real pleasure to be able to introduce Natalie Oman today to you. Associate Professor in the Legal Studies Program at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. Natalie is published in the areas of political philosophy, Indigenous studies, international law, and is the author of a UN report on the prevention of atrocity crimes against Indigenous peoples in Latin America. Most recent book is The Responsibility to Protect in International Law, Philosophical Investigations. Natalie's current research reinterprets classical sources of international legal rules to highlight their democratizing potential as avenues of inclusion for non-state political communities. It's been a real pleasure to have Natalie in the hallways with us this term, and thank you so much for joining us today, Natalie. Very much look forward to the talk.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thank you all for your patience. I'd like to begin by thanking, in a more formal way, the Center for Global Studies for welcoming me this year, and to acknowledge with gratitude and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory I am working and living, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. My paper today is, as so often is the case with global talks, a work in progress, and I really want to underscore that I solicit and warmly welcome your comments and criticisms, but at the end of the talk. The talk is part of a larger project that aims to reinterpret the classical sources of international law from within the dominant occidental paradigm of international lawmaking. The purpose of this reinterpretive exercise is to reveal and challenge the foundational assumptions that underpin an exclusionary system of international law built upon the non-recognition of Indigenous and other non-state peoples. The paper is in conversation with thinkers who challenge these assumptions from a variety of traditions: the Third World approaches to international law school, subaltern studies, and Indigenous legal theory. It's intended to contribute to the practice of what Upendra Bakshi calls juridical resistance in the nooks and crannies of international adjudication. Following many of those other scholars and activists, it works within the terms of a neo-formalist understanding of international law by assembling reminders for a purpose. My method here is to look and see, as Ludwig Wittgenstein urged, to observe the juris generative sources that help us to predict people's norm-governed behavior in the real world, and to glimpse, very partially, the complex interactions that lead to the slow acknowledgement of these processes and forces. Of course, the effect of reporting on all of this looking and seeing is to advocate for greater congruity between lived reality and the formal account of international law in the dominant narrative. And there is a danger to this inherently conserving and conservative tactic, as Audre Lorde memorably explained. But I can sleep at night because practicing insider tactics in the short term doesn't preclude others from practicing outsider tactics in the long term. Trying to change the interpretation of key pillars of the dominant system, the sources of international law, and who is recognized as having agency to make international law, doesn't have to get in the way of others who are working outside of the system. For example, by building transnational Indigenous legal relationships, or by rejuvenating and developing other paradigms, such as Islamic international law or CR. These can be complementary tactics that serve the same strategic goals. So all of that having been said, today I'd like to examine a classical source of international law called General Principles with you. More specifically, I propose to explore an historically neglected type or subcategory of general principles that, unlike other established sources of international law, does not originate in the juris generative authority of states. General principles of this class include human rights and human rights protection norms, such as sustainable development, the principles of prevention and precaution, and the right to a healthy environment, among others. This class of general principles is enormously relevant right now for fighting climate cases, for recognizing non-state actors as authors and addressees of international law, and for identifying shared values in a time of global existential crisis. The democratizing and inclusionary potential of this source of international law will be the focus of this presentation. Article 38(1) of the Statute of the International Court of Justice is the conventional starting point for a discussion of sources of international law. The list of sources that appears there is simply a guide for the judges of the ICJ as to the categories of rules to be applied in considering cases brought before the court. Although this article is not an exhaustive catalog and includes several sources that had not been recognized before the 19th century, it has long been treated as a canonical summary of the sources of international law. But the list itself, the list of sources, predates the International Court of Justice by a generation. It was actually first created in 1920 to guide the judges of the Permanent Court of International Justice, the precursor of the ICJ. And the 10 international legal experts who drafted that list of sources met under the auspices of the League of Nations. After the PCIJ became defunct, the Article 38 list was simply copied over into the statute of the new ICJ. Here, of course, is a list of the countries of membership of the Advisory Committee of Jurists in 1920. Not a terribly inclusive list, and all of whose members were educated in Western universities, as you would imagine. So the consequence of this is that the standard list of sources of international law that we rely upon today, unreflectively in many cases, is a list that actually reflects conventional Eurocentric legal thinking of more than a century ago. These sources include international conventions, international custom, and the general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. These are the primary sources that are recognized in the statute of the PCIJ and again in the statute of the ICJ. And they're supplemented by subsidiary sources of international law that are listed as including judicial opinions and the opinions of well-recognized legal scholars. The most influential early appearance of the idea that we see in this last slide, the idea that general principles of law recognized by civilized nations could be a source of international legal rules, probably appears in the notion that a common sense of juridical right and wrong can give rise to legally binding norms. And this appears in the preamble of the 1899 Hague Convention, dealing with the regulations on the laws and customs of war on land. And again in the 1907 Hague Convention 4 on the same subject, in a passage known as the Martens Clause. The humanitarian law rules whose existence is asserted by this clause are deemed to be binding on states, although they do not originate in state consent, but in, as the Martens Clause states, the laws of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. So how does this phrase influence the list of sources that we rely upon today? Well, the PCIJ Advisory Committee's decision to include general principles on an equal footing with treaties and international custom reflected the influence of this Martens Clause and of other natural law tendencies in international legal debates over the sources of international law. Article 38 itself was a product of competing tendencies toward what Koskenimi calls apology and utopia, the reality that state consent is integral to the effectiveness of the legal system and the idealistic force of values such as justice and fairness. Of course, the members, the Advisory Committee of Jurists members' theoretical commitments, national juristic traditions, whether common law or civil law, impacted the formulation of this list, but it was also a reflection of various draft schemes that had been received for consideration by the committee from both states and individuals. And these draft schemes appear to have informed the suggestion of Baron Edouard Descamps, chairman of the Advisory Committee, that in addition to conventions and customary international law, the new court should have recourse to les règles de droit international telles que les reconnaît la conscience juridique des peuples civilisés. So we see here, of course, the language of the Martens Clause being reflected in Descamps' proposal. And I apologize, I've just swapped to my slides. So a version of Descamps' proposal was, of course, eventually agreed to by the committee members. And the English wording that was settled upon to describe this source was the well-known formulation that we've just been looking at: general principles of international law recognized by civilized nations. And this, of course, echoed several of the guiding draft schemes that had drawn upon the Martens Clause. Now, in his much cited 1953 text, General Principles of Law as Applied by International Courts and Tribunals, legal scholar Bin Cheng maintained that as a consequence of this genealogy, and because the proceedings of the committee were conducted exclusively in French, committee members' use in practice of several French phrases, la conscience juridique and des peuples civilisés, must be considered in assessing the scope of general principles as they came to be included in Article 38(1)(c). He argued that the concept of peuple civilisé could be broken down, and the idea of peuple understood to actually refer not to nations with a capital N, as in United Nations or League of Nations, but instead, in a more general sense, to the idea of a people, for instance, as in the Scottish nation, the French nation, the Maori nation, and so on. Some further support for this view is found in the fact that at various points in the drafting, when the language of the debate in French was translated multiple times as the draft evolved, sometimes peuple was translated nation with a small n, and sometimes nation with a capital N. So there was confusion about what the precise referent of the concept of peuple civilisé was. This suggests that the inclusion of the term nations in Article 38(1)c can be interpreted to indicate that communities were meant to be the locus of the juridical conscience that is the subject matter of the clause, and that these communities might not be organized in the form of centralized and hierarchical polities with the formal status of states. The explicit language of the article tells us, however, that in order to participate in the recognition process of the general principle, these communities must be civilized. Without question, the term civilized conveyed the discriminatory Eurocentric presumption that only normative orders characteristic of centralized and hierarchically organized states, and hierarchically organized political communities could be understood as having the character of law. At the time of drafting, many non-European societies were classified by Europeans and their settler colonies as lacking capital L law because they did not conform to a European standard of political legal centralization and hierarchy. Approaching the qualifying phrase of civilized nations in this way suggests that its function was to safeguard against subjectivity and possible arbitrariness on the part of the judge, as she sought to interpret the content of the common sense of juridical right and wrong invoked by Article 38(1)c as a source of international law. So the functional purpose of including the phrase of civilized nations in Article 38(1) was thus to interject a gatekeeping mechanism for filtering candidates for general principles of international law. A gatekeeping mechanism whose merits and interpretation are open to contemporary critique and revision. In a 1928 essay that enjoyed wide influence in the world of Anglo-American legal scholarship, Benjamin Cardozo warned against the tyranny of concepts. He said that when they are treated as real existences and developed with merciless disregard of their consequences, they become our tyrants rather than our servants. He counseled that when these concepts lead to oppression or injustice, we treat them as provisional hypotheses to be reformulated and restrained, and not to forget that they were created to serve our common ends. Like Judge Abdulkawi A. Yusuf of the ICJ, I am persuaded that the term of civilized nations may not bear much practical significance today, and that Article 38(1)c should be interpreted to serve our common ends, as Cardozo advised. I agree with Judge Yusuf and a distinguished roster of his colleagues and predecessors on the bench of the ICJ that for long enough, warranted critique of this filtering phrase has served as an obstacle to reimagining general principles as an entry point for a more inclusionary vision of international lawmaking. General principles of international law are ripe for contemporary reinterpretation, aimed at disrupting the exclusionary order that they originally helped to consolidate. I'm just going to improve the lighting here for a moment. Maybe that's a little better. So, examination of the 1920 Advisory Committee proceedings reveals that the discussion of general principles encompassed at least 4 different forms of legal norm, reflecting aspects of both positive law and natural law traditions. All of these forms have been acknowledged in subsequent jurisprudence of the ICJ and other international tribunals. They include principles common to municipal legal systems that could be adapted to the needs of the international legal order, such as the rules of evidence, jurisdiction, and procedure. principles necessary to the functioning of any legal system, such as good faith, principles derived from existing rules of international law, such as the prohibition of the use of force and territorial integrity, and principles of a moral and normative character, which reflect values widely shared by members of the international community. It is, of course, this last category that is of greatest interest to us today. This final type of general principle involves a class of dynamic and unformulated principles of law that are expressive of elementary considerations of humanity, as in the Martens Clause. When this class or subcategory of general principles is invoked in ICJ decisions, and I'll confine myself today to speaking of ICJ decisions, they are never referred to as general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. They appear in ICJ jurisprudence as principles of international law, just principles, general principles, or general principles of international law. Axiomatic examples are human rights and human rights protection norms. The opinio juris communis that identifies principles in this subcategory is objectively validated through recognition by an appropriate interpretive community, which subsequent practice and judicial and scholarly opinion suggest is not limited to states. How does this process occur? Norms belonging to this class of general principles come to be recognized as specifically jural norms through a process that was first described in 1958 by the Italian legal scholar Giuseppe Sperduti. And it should perhaps be mentioned that Sperduti served with distinction for 3 decades on the European Commission of Human Rights and was the mentor of Antonio Cassese, later president of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Guided by the Martens Clause, Sperduti argued that there is an international norm creation process similar to, but distinct from, the customary process, which recognizes the demands of public conscience, the esigenze della coscienza pubblica, in the form of general rules of international law. According to Sperduti, the prohibitions against the slave trade and wars of aggression were juridified in this way. Like other general principles of this type, they originated as moral norms. The process of recognition, riconoscimento giuridico di esigenze della coscienza pubblica, or RG process, moved these prohibitions along the continuum of normativity toward the pole of legality. Sperduti observes that this transformative recognition of the demands of public conscience often, but not necessarily, takes place through the reiteration of a norm in international conventions and declarations. This same normative progression has much more recently been identified and described by the legal theorist Günther Teubner. Teubner describes how scandalized norms, as he calls them, capture the attention of global publics following a local crisis and become integrated into global law through a complex iterative process involving NGOs, protest movements, business entities, and national and international courts and tribunals, a process that he calls social positivization. An example of this dynamic process occurred in the 1990s with the rapid emergence of an international legal norm prohibiting the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. Incidents of organized sexual violence during the 1990s in the Bosnian War and the Rwandan genocide received global publicity through media reports and eventually the reports of a UN committee of experts. This inspired what has been described as an extraordinary public outcry that was reflected in a series of Security Council resolutions, including the one establishing the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, or the ICTY. This demand of public conscience was eventually read back into existing prohibitions of crimes against humanity war crimes, and torture in the enabling statutes and jurisprudence of the ICTY and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. The prohibition against organized sexual violence was later incorporated into the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Although Spertoluzzi did not explicitly identify the norms produced through this RG process with the general principles of Article 38(1)(c), his work provides us with an early description of the method of juridification of such norms, and Teubner's insights about scandalization help to elaborate it. I'm just going to pause for a moment to note the questions that this brief overview raises about which public and whose accounting of its conscience we're relying on here. And then I'm going to ask you to continue to suspend your disbelief to give me time to finish my story. The RG process moves norms that express elementary considerations of humanity along the continuum of normativity. This process involves a hermeneutic interchange between the activities of relevant interpretive communities and the accretion of practices congruent with the norm in question. Such practices are undertaken by a panoply of local and transnational NGOs, international organizations, civil society actors, domestic and international tribunals and courts, private and hybrid transnational standard-setting organizations, corporate actors, and states. And they work to elaborate and limit such emerging norms. Those of you who know the work of Jutta Brunei and Stephen Toop will appreciate the great debt that I owe them in that description. This RG process is most easily appreciated if international law is conceived on the model of a deliberative practice, a discourse with the shared purpose of forming and defending judgments. A deliberative practice of this type is a Wittgensteinian language game in which participants form an interpretive community. Such interpretive communities engage in activities in which the articulation of reasons in order to make and defend judgments is a primary activity. And these kinds of interpretive communities include those involved in judicial decision-making, moral reasoning, and aesthetic criticism. As shared ways of proceeding are negotiated over time, participants deploy argumentative strategies and animating norms that may not initially be recognized as valid by other interlocutors. Their degree of openness to new gambits and indeed classes of interlocutors may vary over time. However, part of what it is to engage in a deliberative practice consists in the construction of conversational and conceptual bridges that seek to make diverse argumentative strategies intelligible. At its most productive, the process of creating such bridges entails what Hannah Arendt calls enlarged thinking and leads to a form of mutual understanding that can result in what she calls a sensus communis. The bindingness of law depends upon the presence in some measure of such a common sense. It is through this process that the core and penumbra of an emerging general principle is staked out. And indeed, the boundary between the core and penumbral content of any given international legal concept can fluctuate over time as the locus of an initial overlapping consensus among members of relevant interpretive communities shifts. The deliberative practice of the participating interpretive communities, through their practical and rhetorical engagement, develops and applies the norm, contesting and refining its meaning and range of application. This practice in itself produces an iterative filtering or gatekeeping effect, accomplished through the ongoing deliberative dialogue by relevant interpretive communities. And of course, the memberships of those communities themselves are also subject to contestation and deliberation. Consequently, the general principles that result from the RG process are always the contextual product of struggle, of efforts to achieve mutual recognition, political justice, legal standing, and so forth. And here I'm borrowing Jean Cohen's words. The deliberative practice of interpretive communities is consequently not neutral. It is, as Marty Koskanimi observes, a process of articulating political preferences into legal claims that cannot be detached from the conditions of political contestation in which they are made. And so the deliberative practice of international law, as I've described it here, is also a hegemonic technique, undertaken as a means of securing specific outcomes in particular fields of contestation, and of imposing and maintaining a certain interpretation of the rules of the game of international law. So what I'd like to turn to now is a partial genealogy of general principles in the Charter era. The idea that the demands of public conscience, inspired by elementary considerations of humanity, can give rise to international legal norms is developed through a handful of key judicial decisions delivered in the UN Charter era. The language and conceptual accoutrements vary, as I've already indicated, and most but not all of the formulations frame these norms as general principles. Most but not all are grounded in a natural law approach. In some of these decisions, elementary considerations of humanity are invoked directly as themselves constituting a general principle of international law. On other occasions, this category of general principles is instead referred to through instances of the general class that it represents, as in Judge Kotaro Tanaka's dissenting opinion in the Southwest Africa cases that will be discussed in a moment. But a review of the peripatetic development of international law in this area suggests that elementary considerations of humanity give rise to a class of general principles that put into practice considerations of humanity. This class of principles is comprised of human rights and human rights protection norms, as I've already said. So to try to sketch the irregular development of this concept by members of the ICJ and give you a sense of some of the confusing usages that have slowed a general appreciation of the nature of this class of general principles. I'm going to canvass several, but not nearly as many as I would like, International Court of Justice decisions. In the first case decided by the ICJ in 1949, this class of general principles was invoked by the court in its finding that the Albanian government was under obligation to alert those in transit through its territorial waters of the existence of a minefield. Such obligations are based not on the Hague Convention of 1907, number 8, according to the court, which is applicable in time of war, but on certain general and well-recognized principles, namely elementary considerations of humanity, even more exacting in peace than in war, the principle of the freedom of maritime communication, and every state's obligation not to allow knowingly its territory to be used for acts contrary to the rights of other states. The emphasis is mine. In employing language drawn from Martin's Clause and originally applied to the specific context of humanitarian law, the court makes clear in this decision that it conceives of elementary considerations of humanity as a freestanding general principle of international law. This understanding of elementary considerations plays a notable role decades later in the Nicaragua and nuclear weapons advisory opinion cases, which unfortunately I won't have time to discuss in any detail today. In his important dissenting opinion in the Southwest Africa cases, second phase, in 1966, Judge Kotaro Tanaka reaches the conclusion that human rights and human rights protection norms are general principles of international law. These ICJ cases concern South Africa's attempt to extend its colonial authority over Namibia under the League of Nations mandate system into the Charter era. The applicants, Ethiopia and Liberia, argued that the apartheid system administered by South Africa in Namibia violated norms prohibiting racial discrimination and segregation, and that those norms have the status of general principles of international law under Article 38(1)(c). In his dissent, Judge Tanaka offers an evolutionary account of this clause. He develops this by relying on the procès-verbaux of the PCIJ Advisory Committee of Jurists, Baron Descamps' original proposal regarding la conscience juridique reconnue des peuples civilisés, and Bin Cheng's interpretation of that committee's deliberations. Excuse me. Tanaka adopts, excuse me, adopts the view that the structure of Article 38(1) reflects a self-conscious intention by the committee members to strike a compromise among positive and natural law elements. He asserts that Article 38 as a whole was intended by the committee members to acknowledge the law-generating roles, excuse me, of both consent-based sources and sources deeply rooted in the conscience of mankind and of any reasonable man, sick. He reasons that Part C of the article provides for recognition of two categories of law with an international character, and that in addition to norms drawn from municipal legal systems, these include norms that form part of the law of the world community. Among this second class of norms are the concept of human rights and of their protection. This class includes the prohibition against racial discrimination and segregation at issue in the Southwest Africa cases. In Judge Tanaka's view, the role of states, where such rules are concerned, is simply declaratory. Furthermore, in a slightly different connection, Judge Tanaka observes that the legislative imperfections in the definition of human rights and freedoms and the lack of mechanism for implementation do not constitute a reason for denying their existence and the need for their legal protection. Gaps in the machinery of international human rights identification and protection are therefore not impediments to recognizing the legal character of human rights and human rights protection principles for Judge Tanaka. On his view, Article 38(1)(c) does not require the consent of states as a condition of the recognition of the general principles. States which do not recognize this principle or even deny its validity are nevertheless subject to its rule. Thus, Judge Tanaka's opinion makes two key contributions to our understanding of the class of general principles to which the products of the RG process belong. First, he identifies them as human rights and human rights protection norms. And secondly, he distinguishes the law ascertainment process for general principles of this class from that of customary international law, when he observes that the practice and opinion juris of states do not play a determinative role in the RG process. I'll restrict myself to mentioning two further decisions from the bench of the ICJ. They not only provide insights into aspects of the RG process, but also offer examples of three specific human rights protection norms recognized as general principles of international law. So I'll begin with Judge C.G. Weeramantri's separate opinion in the Gabčíkovo-Nagymaros project case from 1997. Judge Weeramantry offers support for an inclusive account of the demands of public conscience and an expansive reading of the role of non-state actors in developing practices of legality to support emergent legal norms of this type. The Gabčíkovo-Nagymaros dispute arose as a consequence of the Budapest Treaty, concluded in 1977 between Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The treaty committed the parties to cooperate in the construction of an extensive waterworks along the Danube River, which forms the international boundary between the two countries, or did. The purposes of the project were to eliminate flooding, create a source of hydroelectric power, and to improve the navigability of the river. In the early 1980s, because of economic difficulties and popular protests inspired by environmental concerns, Hungary suspended its involvement and then attempted to withdraw completely from the treaty. Slovakia had succeeded Czechoslovakia as a party to the treaty in 1993, and this action by Hungary led it to undertake an alternative means of achieving the project's goals, by itself diverting the Danube River. The two countries jointly brought their resulting dispute to the ICJ. In his separate opinion, Judge Wiramantri makes a wide-ranging and philosophically sophisticated case for recognizing the international legal character of the principle of sustainable development. Although his primary aim is to demonstrate the customary international legal character of the SD, or Sustainable Development Principle, the arguments he adduces offer direct and perhaps equally strong support for regarding it as a general principle of law as well, as he himself recognizes. Judge Wiramantri describes sustainable development as providing the conceptual and legal apparatus for reconciling the human rights to development and to the protection of the environment. These features of sustainable development, which make it indispensable for the realization of two human rights, place the principle squarely in the class of human rights protection norms. Like Judge Tanaka, with whose opinion in the Southwest Africa cases he demonstrates familiarity, Judge Wiramantri emphasizes the evolutionary potential of international legal principles. And the statement here expresses this. The ethical and human rights related aspects of environmental law bring it within the category of law so essential to human welfare that we cannot apply to today's problems in the field the standards of yesterday. With this assertion, Judge Wiramantri affirms Judge Tanaka's observation that human rights and human rights protection standards that inform the opinio juris communis change over time. For Judge Wiramantri, international law recognizes the juris generative authority of both global legal traditions, including those of polities that do not take the form of modern states, and contemporary practices of legality involving non-state actors and fora. As he concludes, when the statute of the court described the sources of international law as including the general principles of law recognized by civilized nations, it expressly opened a door to the entry of such principles into modern international law. Perhaps counterintuitively, the growing inclusiveness and therefore diversity of the interpretive community perceived as relevant to international lawmaking does not preclude the development of an opinio juris communis with regard to certain issues. This insight is expressed within the rubric of a natural law approach by Judge Antonio Augusto Cansado Trindade in his separate opinion in the Pulp Mills case. In the majority decision in this case, the court had already identified one new human rights protection norm by determining that environmental impact assessment was a requirement under general international law. In his separate opinion, Judge Cansado Trindade argues in favor of recognizing the general principle status of two further environmental law principles derived from an opinio juris communis, the principle of prevention and the precautionary principle. His genealogy of these general principles emphasizes both the RG process through his discussion of the role played by a universal juridical conscience and the evolving nature of fundamental international legal norms. The case that provided the occasion for this analysis involved a dispute between Argentina and Uruguay over the environmental effects of wood pulp mills on the banks of the river Uruguay that had been authorized by the Uruguayan government. As in the previous case, the river constitutes an international boundary between Uruguay and Argentina and is the subject of the 1975 Statute of the River Uruguay, a treaty which establishes both procedural and substantive obligations for both parties. In their preliminary submission to the court, both countries had expressly referred to the principles of prevention and precaution. In Judge Cansado Trindade's view, these two general principles are, like others of the human rights and human rights protection class, indicators of the degree of evolution of the status conscientiae of the international community as a whole. He explains the origins of these international legal norms as follows. General principles of law emanate, in my perception, from human conscience, from the universal juridical conscience, which I regard as the ultimate material source of all law. A clear illustration is provided by the gradual acknowledgement in the last decades of the principles proper to a domain like that of international environmental law, such as those of prevention and precaution. As consciousness has emerged of the pressing need to secure the protection of the environment, given its vulnerability, the risks surrounding everyone, and the harmful consequences of irreparable damages caused to it. The awakening of such consciousness has accounted for the assertion of those principles. As Judge Gonçalo Trindades' argument makes clear, exemplary norms of this type are those concerned with the fragility of embodied human life on this earth, embedded in rich relationships of interchange with the animate and inanimate worlds. Excuse me. These human rights and human rights protection norms are inspired by a negative solidarity, first identified by Judge Tanaka in the Southwest Africa cases. This form of solidarity is based upon our appreciation of the vulnerability to suffering we share with others, rooted in imagined or real experiences of the damaged life, rather than a vision of the good life. Consequently, it is best described as a negative solidarity rather than a positive one. This negative solidarity serves as the ground for a sensus communis juris and can eventually give rise to a shared conviction that law is needed, the demands of public conscience. This is a phenomenological reading of the basis for legal recognition of the felt need for what we might call human security. It offers an alternative to the standard natural law approach adopted by most advocates of a public conscience basis for general principles. At the same time, I'd like to note that it does not rule out a natural law justification. It does not depend upon a presumption of universally shared values, but on a phenomenological observation of shared human vulnerability. The particular harms that become the focus of public conscience at any given time can evolve as widely held notions of the defining qualities of a flourishing human life change over time, depending on which communities are included in the interpretive conversation and what the material conditions of their existence are at any given moment. This reading can allow for multiple culturally and theoretically distinct accounts of the justification for recognizing and emerging general principles, international legal normativity, leaving room for intercultural legitimation through an overlapping consensus over time. The general principles of sustainable development, environmental impact, assessment, prevention, and precaution outlined above fall into the camp of human rights and human rights protection norms classified by Judge Tanaka as a neglected aspect of general principles of international law. The preceding discussion has asserted that this class of norms, identified by a series of jurists and publicists in the past century, can be understood as the products of a process of legal recognition of the demands of public conscience, inspired by elementary considerations of humanity. This RG process is the means by which norms like sustainable development and the other principles I've mentioned have been recognized as general principles of international law. This public conscience class affirms the legal relevance of a community sense of the requirements of juridical right and wrong. As a dimension of Article 38(1)(c), it shares with the more commonly cited types of general principles a revolutionary potential, since it allows a court to bring to bear a source of law that is not entirely based on the consent of states. The public conscience dimension further recognizes the jurisgenerative capability of non-state actors, in the sense that the RG process translates a moral impulse derived from civil society and rooted in elementary considerations of humanity. It translates this moral impulse into a legal norm and accomplishes this transformation through a procedure of validation and elaboration that recognizes both state and non-state actors' contributions. I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you'll give me about 60 seconds, I will run down the hall so that I can take questions and comments from the vantage point of the boardroom where our colleagues are all waiting. Just be a moment.
Thank you, Natalie. We'll see you soon. So as we continue our, we're unmuted. So thank you. As we continue our adjustment to hybrid global talks, we're just taking a moment so that Natalie, who was in her office, can now come and join us in C168. And yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
He's going right here.
Right there.
Okay.
Sure. Can I get a sense from the audience of people who would like to ask questions or make some observations? I'll be sure to pay attention to the people to whom I've turned my back the whole time. Sorry about that. But you may be stopping for a coffee en route. Jeremy, do you want to lead us off? I mean, I'll ask you to wait until Natalie's here, but.
Yep, be happy to.
Okay, thank you. I'll start a kind of a running list. And Kaylee, can I ask you to keep an eye on the chat in case?
Yeah, of course.
Great.
Ready?
Thank you. Welcome.
Pound.
3D Natalie, it's all over.
So do you want me behind the, okay, here. Is that okay? It's okay. You want to stand? You know what, if it's set up so that it's here, then I'll stay here. I just sort of like my notes to be up, but I can.
That's excellent. Jeremy, can I turn to you for our first question?
Sure. Thank you, Natalie. It's great to see you again. Look forward to seeing you in person. Natalie, my question really is a request for further explication. So you began the talk quoting, for example, Marty Kostaniemi, emphasizing how the notion of collective deliberation is necessarily a political process, and endorsing that view, right? That what one might say was a disenchanted view of deliberation. But you could be suspected of taking quite an idealized view at the end when you talk about the community sense of justice in the singular, about being able to extrapolate from conditions of humanity, elementary conditions of humanity, to these principles. You spoke of a moral impulse, and I actually think those two things can work together. But do you? How do you see those in tension? How do you reconcile those two?
Well, I'm sorry that I'm not as good as I should be at using my voice to indicate air quotes. So the moral impulse at the end was a quotation from Giuseppe Sperduti. But there is I've given you an idealized account of the way in international laws of deliberative practice, and there's a process of interpretation that sounds suspiciously like Habermas's account of deliberation over norms. And of course, I do think it's Wittgensteinian, but at the same time, it sounds as if it's some kind of abstract and neutral process. And what I'd like to try to gesture at is something that I think is just accurate. It's just an accurate description of how international legal norms of this type really do evolve. And that is that it's a messy, complex conversation, because I don't know any other word to indicate that kind of interchange, in which a high degree of intersubjective validity has to be generated through the contestation, through the explanation, through the imperfect understanding of different interpretive communities interacting to try to generate a shared notion. And I think that, of course, it seems ridiculous to talk about elementary considerations of humanity as if there's a single shared notion of what those are. But if you
scrape that down to the bare minimum, to this notion of negative solidarity, I think, and the idea of the fundamental forms of harm that make it impossible to live in organized human communities and to have any kind of international society. I think that it's not quite as difficult as it might at first appear. And I think that it's possible to sort of have your Koskenimi and oppose him too. If you're careful about restricting that notion of negative solidarity to the kinds of norms that I think fall within the class of human rights and human rights protection norms, I don't think I think it's perfectly consistent that international environmental norms are emerging at this moment as recognized members of this class, because this is a moment in the last 30 years when people around the world are increasingly aware of the fact that transboundary environmental issues are existential issues. And so elementary considerations of humanity becomes a category that makes sense in that kind of context. I know that's a very incomplete answer, Jeremy, and I look forward to being harshly cross-examined later.
Yeah, no, that was a good answer. Thanks.
Thanks.
I thought maybe Natalie would ask you to resolve the tension.
Well, I maybe will mention, Jeremy sat on my thesis defense committee for my first doctorate. So he has a long history with asking me difficult questions in uncomfortable situations. Although he was very kind on that particular occasion, I must say.
We often look at tensions as needing resolution, don't we? It's sometimes uncomfortable to just accept the tension.
It's hard not to, you want a grand theory. Everybody, I mean, there's a strong impulse toward that. I mean, it's for everybody but Koskenimi, there's a strong impulse toward something that explains and resolves everything.
Denmark, please.
I hope the general audience can hear me. I'm a political scientist who has been interdisciplinarily wandering in the land of law for quite a long time. And I'm interested in questions of legal mobilization and change. And I wondered if you could give us a little bit more context from the beginning where you talked about juridical resistances. And I always appreciate reference to Audre Lorde. And then my interest got piqued when you talked about the scandalized norms and the way in which NGOs and businesses also were able to transform law. But when you mentioned the 4 cases at the end, I was not sure then they were just recognitions to me, the political scientist, by the elitist judges who finally are writing something. And yes, this was a dissenting opinion, it wasn't even the majority, but were they examples of alternative influences that were at least being debated? And how did this trickle up to the judges? So who were the organizations or the groups or the uncivilized nations? Because Uruguay and Argentina, I don't know, and Albania, again, maybe. So I'm just wondering if you could give us a little bit more context on the process in between, because there is something missing and I'd love to hear more about that.
Thanks very much, Dagmar. There's lots missing. Is am I okay for audio if I turn away?
Can people hear Natalie okay?
That's okay, otherwise just talk to the.
I'm not very good at not looking at the person who's asking me. So it's a very spare account indeed. This is the paper this is based on is a lot longer than what you heard today, and I'm sorry for all of the gaps. I mean, some of them will be my own, inadequacy, but lots of them are just, I was trying to figure out what was the minimum amount that I could include, so there was coherence. So the purpose of just dealing with a handful of ICJ cases was to sort of address the fact that the Article 38(1)(c) is supposed to be a directive to judges of the ICJ, and it's just a simple, and I only used the Charter Bureau just because there wasn't very much time. It's the process, and that's just a kind of stamp of approval on these norms. And of course, the stamp of approval is not consistently given across the membership of the court most of the decisions, as you say, that I mentioned were either separate opinions or dissents. And this is something that I think will change because of the composition of the court, and partly because of the advocacy of a judge who is a member of the court and who has just recently stepped down as president of the court, Judge Yusuf. And he's made this his hobby horse. He addressed the 6th Committee of the United Nations General Assembly in 2019 and spoke about unwritten sources of international law and explained an account of general principles, which doesn't quite connect the dots in the way that I do, but that certainly recognizes and advocates for the use of general principles as a living form of law. So I think the only example I gave you of a kind of bottom-up process was the one involving the crimes of sexualized violence during the Bosnian and Rwandan conflicts. And those, I of course talked about how they got the imprimatur of the Security Council, and then they worked their way into the jurisprudence of the international tribunals. But there are many other norms that we will be very interested in that haven't made their way into the discourse of the global interpretive legal community in that way. So one less formal step would be the right to a healthy environment. So the right to a healthy environment was recognized in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, I think 15 or 20 years ago, when Judge Gonzalo Trindade was a member of that court. And it's only in the last weeks been recognized by the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations as being a right, as having international legal status. Whether that means that, and of course it's because of the advocacy and work of grassroots organizations around the world that the norm ever captured the attention of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And so it's not a consequence of top-down lawmaking, it's a consequence of bottom-up advocacy. A different example would be the right of physical and cultural survival of Indigenous peoples. This is a right that's recognized in the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Court and the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. In both of these bodies have recognized this norm as being rooted in Indigenous legal orders. And the recognition, I did work on this with a colleague, and we have a paper that's in draft form about this right, which appears to us to be an established regional general principle because of the adoption into constitutional and legislative materials in several different in several different countries in Latin America of that norm. So the bottom-up process is partly just a description of how norms that, like the norm of free, fair, and informed consent, that is enshrined in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but which still has a controversial status in international law, how that came to be understood as a right in international law. That process is revealed by a close examination of the history of general principles.
I'll turn to Jordan now. People can hear okay. Hey, will you please let us know if there's any complications with the hybridity? Jordan.
Thanks, Nat. I found that a really interesting talk. I'm not informed in the area, so I'll kind of excuse myself from the outset there. But I wanted just, in the combination of the two answers you just gave, I'm trying to understand, I guess, the approach here. It seemed, in response to the first question from Jeremy, that you ultimately, I think in your answer, defended a notion of universal or human needs by suggesting that sufficiently stripped down that we might find grounds in those kind of negative claims that you made around an environment that we can live in, for example. on those very spare pillars that we maybe could found a universal or human argument for general principles in law. But then in your response to Dagmar and some of the specific cases you used in your presentation, I heard principles with which that I think are really important, principles relating to sexual violence, relating to racial segregation and exclusion, physical and cultural survival. I don't, so depending on how we interpret them, but they sound more robust to me. They sound less fair than perhaps the position to which you sort of, I don't know, could I say retreated? I'm not sure, to the position that you took at the end of the first answer. And it strikes me that you are interested in an international law that offer these more robust protections that might not be that unlike, say, an environment in which the human species can survive, don't sound quite as negative, perhaps don't sound quite as elemental, So I'm just wondering what, how those fit together, and what ultimately your solution to that problem of generating kind of universal human norms is, and how it differs from past, say, approaches to generate universal human norms.
Thanks very much for that question, Jordan. It's so helpful when people press you on the things that are the most awkward, because then you have to try to get clear. So I think that I may be failing to distinguish, because of my own choice of terminology, I may be failing to distinguish between what I'm describing, which is a series of norms that have been advocated for and recognized by various judges sitting on the International Court of Justice, and an ideal that I think is being attributed to me, and maybe my flights of poetical language are the cause of this, the idea that I'm arguing in favor of a positive account of solidarity, of some substantive set of norms that describe not the damaged life, but the good life. And you seem to be, I think you suspect that some of the norms that have already been recognized by the ICJ fall into the category of the good life rather than the damaged life. So I think I would take issue with you. I think we could argue about whether racial discrimination is gravy, like the protection against racial discrimination is, is that really not minimal enough? But we can, we can take them norm by norm and try to figure out, okay, well, is this really an account of the good life, or is it just the minimum necessary to live a life? But I think that what it is that elementary considerations of humanity are protecting is something that needs to be scrutinized. I don't think I have to answer that question. I think the concept is being used actively by members of the court, by scholars, by advocates around the world, and I think that requires close examination. And I think that we find language in the nuclear weapons advisory opinion decision, and here and there in phrases from Judge Reimagining, in phrases from Gonzalo Trindade and others, and Yusuf, we find phrases that suggest, that push us in the direction of thinking about jus cogens and erga omnes principles. And those are particular kind of special types of principles that are not frequently used and are not well understood, that have made their way into discourse of international law. I think that it's something about the minimum required for international law to be a thing that matters, for an international society that employs international law to exist. It's something about the sort of values that are necessarily
present and that play an animating role in the kind of community for which international law has been created. There's some kind of a logical connection there that I think, and I can of course speculate about what I think it should be, but I think that we can find suggestions in a variety of places. And I think we can start with the Martin Clause back in 1899. I hope that that's the beginning of an answer.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Now, I wonder if I could come in with a question. I was intrigued by the Advisory Committee of Jurists, 1920, and their membership. So my question is a little bit more about the role of actual individuals here, the lawyers themselves, or the judges. So they did represent countries, I think, like Brazil and Japan, I think, were represented on that. And yet you mentioned that they were all trained in Western universities, and so therefore that committee represented more of a European or Western notion of than they did represent public or community consciousness as might have reflected in Brazil or Japan at that time. So how does that change over time? How do these jurists begin to reflect a broader community than that of the West, which continues, I imagine, for some time to be represented in legal in many universities? How does an individual begin to reflect something more than the Western legal, I won't say consciousness, but training?
I think that it's I'm going to go to Koskanini again. Koskanini writes very pithily in the epilogue to a recent book about legal scholarship in the Global South. He writes about how the first and second generations of third world legal scholars and judges worked within the framework of the dominant paradigm of international law. They worked within it because the machinery for change involved recognition within that system and by those who moved the levers of power within that system. And so some of the most powerful comments on general principles, some of the most sort of influential advocacy of those principles has come from judges who originate in the Global South. And in fact, I don't think I cited anyone today who didn't originate from that part of the world and from those legal cultures. The change, of course, that's occurred is that increasingly judges from those countries have begun to speak on behalf of those legal traditions. And I think there's a wonderful statement by I guess it's Judge Reimagining, who in his Pulp Mills decision, who says that if you read the article, the statute of the ICJ itself, it requires the progressive development of international law and wide consultation by the judges. And he reads back into the statute a small n nation, organized political communities that have a conception of law without any judgment as to whether the conception is horizontal, hierarchical, or anything else. And so he and others like Oman and then Judge Yusuf today have really just set aside this question of the restriction to the old family of nations as the sources of international legal tradition, and they draw upon and they advocate for other legal traditions. They are generally in the minority in the court, but it's certainly something that is happening with increasing frequency and with increasing confidence. And of course, they're judges of the International Court of Justice. They're working within the system, but they're working for change from within the system in a very explicit way. And they follow people like Mohammed Bajawi and other judges from earlier generations who attempted to advocate more explicitly for self-determination and a recognition of the colonial foundations of the list of international legal sources. That's
Can I ask a question?
Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thanks so much for the talks. Really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot. I think my starting place is different than yours in that I'm not entirely. I think that the way that you've articulated, I think, is that there's a growing consensus, and my sense is that we're at the doorstep of the end of the consensus of the liberal international order. And so, you know, I've come to this maybe through a different genealogy or a different way of telling the historical account, probably more through Sam Moyn saying that, you know, human rights starts in the 70s. And it's not something that you can trace back to, you know, you can engage in practices of historiography that create these other origins and then draw those lines forward. But, you know, I find in many parts his account of a political reading of the emergence of human rights to be quite convincing, and namely that they originate in the 1970s in a particular political climate, and that they're mobilized for particular kinds of political ends. So I guess I'm wondering about the way in which other kinds of accounts that might complicate the historical narrative that you've given, and that don't in fact lead us to a consensus within a particular. I can understand that you're identifying consensus within a particular community, the way that you're evoking Wittgenstein. But, you know, there's a consensus emerging within the particular community. But outside that community, that consensus may in fact be losing ground. It may be less and less able to address and account for these other kinds of political forces that are in the world. So I cleared the room. How dare I ask about the end of the international war? So, you know, if that could be presented as a question or a query, what's your thoughts on that?
That's a great question, query or observation, however we categorize it. I think the idea that we're in a period of fragmentation, you know, is not new to me. It's not new to Sam Moyn. The idea that there's a period of fragmentation going on right now, and that consensus over the terms in which the dominant paradigm of international law are framed, that consensus is clearly fragmenting. I mean, that's exactly what's going on. It's under attack, not just because of the presidency of Donald Trump, but because there's increasing awareness of the existence of multiple international laws, not just the dominant paradigm that's the, you know, imposed public law of Europe writ large on the colonized world. I mean, it's transnational indigenous law is a real thing that is growing and increasingly recognized. Great scholarships being done on Islamic international law. It's people even like Lauren Benton, you know, were doing that 20 years ago, and it's become a really, really interesting literature. There's great work being done on Chinese international law, on Chinese historical understandings, and on contemporary Chinese international law that's kind of parallel to the work that used to be done on socialist international law. So I don't at all mean to suggest that there's a growing consensus on a single set of sources of international law. All I'm trying to suggest is that in the specific conversation internal to the legal order we associate with the liberal international system, there's a growing consensus that this
source of international law that hasn't been exploited, that hasn't been made use of, that hasn't been used to perhaps resolve some of the tensions that have made liberal international law intolerable as the reigning sort of legal discourse. That concept of general principles is something that is apparent to more and more people, should be exploited, should be used. So I had a very modest claim compared to, unfortunately, what you took me to be claiming, which, you know, I agree, like that's just not tenable. It doesn't describe reality.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you for helping me to clarify that, because if I left people with that impression, that would be really unfortunate, so thanks.
Well, thank you everybody for participating. Please note that we're still here in this room for another half hour if you'd like to, if you can, or would like to come join us. And otherwise, please join me in thanking Natalie again for a wonderful